All right. So I just started recording a lovely transcript.
Okay.
This is beautiful. All right then. Okay, cool. This is Joseph Popper. He's an artist and designer from England, but he's based in Basel. And he's done a lot of his work about space and how, visualizing different imaginaries of space. And the reason why I wanted to have him come to talk to you is first to show his amazing work, because his work is, I think you find it of inspiration, but also because he's one of the rare people who actually work with things that are complicated related to imaginaries, but also technicalities of space, but in a very sort of like poetic way. And if you're dealing with some aspects of like, what does it mean, to be out there, or like, how can I visualize something that I don't know nothing about or whatever, I think his work might be very relevant for you in that sense. And Joseph as well, like was very nice to actually tailor his presentation for our purpose today. I don't know, just so you can see everyone here. So hopefully this will be of interest to you all, and it's going to be very different from the electronic thing that we've done today. So hopefully it should be quite a nice treat. The floor is yours, whatever you want to add, or if you want to introduce yourself or start straight into your presentation, whatever.
Great, thank you, Sitraka. Hello, everybody. Nice to see you in the back there. Really great to be here. I'm just thinking, Sitraka, maybe it might be worth jumping in. And did you manage to download those videos I shared by any chance?
I had one video.
Yeah, the trailer.
Okay, cool. Yeah, so you want me to play this?
Yeah, I think let's play it. Maybe before we play it, I'll just quickly give you a kind of preview of what today's talk is about. So I'm really pleased to be here. The talk today is called Imagining Outer Space and the Found Fantastic. And today I'll discuss different art and design projects, and I hope to share different methods and processes for imagining outer space across different media. And alongside that, I want to share some insights into my own interests about outer space imaginaries. And I think you'll find today a recurring theme of the talk is an emphasis on the power of thinking through making in the form of iterative and playful prototyping as a means for both describing and exploring different outer space futures. And without further ado, just to try and set the scene with hopefully an engaging start, I'd like to invite Sitraka to play a short trailer which showcases two films that I will talk about in the course of the talk.
And we're back.
Great. I hope you enjoyed that as a start. Those are two films. The first is called Into Orbit, and the second is a project called The One-Way Ticket. So I'm going to try and share my screen now. I'm not particularly literate with Teams, so when I go to share my screen and I start my presentation, I lose sight of you guys. So we
can see it.
Fantastic. So if you cannot hear me at any point, or if there's any questions you'd like to ask, please just give me a shout, because I cannot see you. But I'll try and, I guess, close out my slides and then come back for hopefully a more informal question and answer afterwards. So you can all hear me okay, and you can all see the first slide?
Yeah, we can hear you properly, yeah.
Okay, and you don't see my notes, you just see the image of the kind of quadrant of the 4 projects?
Yes, we can only see this.
Okay, perfect. So I will jump right in, and I hope that the presentation should be about 40 minutes or so, and then we can break into some more questions and discussion. So, right, here we are. Imagining outer space. So I am a designer, an artist and researcher with a background in critical and speculative design. And throughout my work, I consistently engage in critical and conceptual thinking around technological developments and what they can mean for possible futures. And for more than 15 years, which makes me feel a bit old, imagining outer space stands as a central interest in my practice. And my interest in outer space has changed through the course of different projects. So to begin with, outer space was a premise for reframing found places and simple materials for describing extraterrestrial experiences. And over time, these interests have changed from imagining outer space on a more individual to a more collective scale, upon learning about the capacity of shared images of the future to be powerful social and political forces. I work across various media, including film, installation and photography, and my approach regularly transforms found objects, landscapes and film footage in creating playful and critical fictions. I later came to this idea or this concept of the found fantastic, which is described by a scholar called Roger Luckhurst, and I find it very helpful for describing the way I enjoy working with different materials, and also for contextualizing what it is I want to share about my project with you today. And also for later on sharing my interest in outer space simulations, where changing the framing becomes another recurring theme. So I might just read this particular quote from Luckhurst here, who says, "For several years, I have been interested in the idea of the found fantastic, the notion that bits and pieces of the world might already be in some ways fantastic and science fictional, or that it would only take a change of framing to render these objects or experiences broadly fantastic." And I hope that you will find, as I describe these different projects, this notions of bits and pieces of the world with fantastic or science fictional potential and different methods of changing the framing to realize this potential is something which I find recognizable in describing my different projects. So you've already just seen a short clip from this project called Into Orbit, and this is one of 2 projects I'm going to share in quick succession, which are based very much on performative interventions into found urban spaces and working at different scales. So in this case, Into Orbit, it describes an aspiring astronaut figure who tries to experience outer space out of an urban playground. And I'm interested here in how film can be a way of describing an outer space experience out of a more mundane, everyday situation. So returning to the found fantastic, I was interested in the potential of this playground carousel to become a kind of centrifuge for enabling this astronaut to in some ways experience an extraordinary extraterrestrial feeling. Changing the scale to a more model scale, this is a series of photographs called landings, where it's, in simple terms, I took a model of a Mars base, or an imagined Mars base, which is about, I don't know, 20 centimeters high, and I took it with me to different roadwork skips that were situated around Basel, the city where I live, and I was looking at different ways to imagine these kind of residual materials from roadworks as alien terrains. And so this model of a Mars base became my means to try and change the framing, in this case coupled with the use of particular portable light. Again, lighting is important into orbit too, where I used a singular film light attached to a generator, and that singular point of light created this sense of rotation. Again, here, this sense of a singular sun or a kind of celestial body lighting this particular skip turned planet. Another way of changing the framing of a found situation. And here is another custom redshift filter that formed part of my toolkit. And I hope both these projects, landings and into orbit, they demonstrate a certain playfulness, a certain lightness, where, again, to borrow from Luckhurst, using these bits and pieces of the world for science fictional imagery, and this lightness refers to this sense of it only takes a change of framing. So what kind of interventions can be used through the camera lens to change our reading, to change our understanding of an everyday, ordinary sight into something extraordinary or extraterrestrial. And so I mentioned my background in critical and speculative design, and that was very much formed by my master's studies at the Royal College of Art. Both Sitraka and Andy and I are alumni of a particular program called Design Interactions. And it was here that a certain methodology for imagining outer space began to crystallize, which I dub zero gravity, zero budget. And this method, or this title, describes a way of being inventive with simple materials as a means for imagining high technological scenarios. And this was very much embodied by working through my master's project, which was called The One-Way Ticket. And this is a multidimensional project that imagines a one-way journey into space and its various implications across a range of scales and concerns, from the human experience to more psychological and logistical concerns about what it means to, in one way to put it, to never come back, and this unique, unprecedented scenario that this opens up. And from the get-go, I was quite determined to try and describe this speculative future in outer space on film, and many of my efforts were designed with this goal in mind. And so the end output of the project consisted of a short film and a space capsule installation, which was really started as a kind of artifact of the filmmaking process and then became a standalone installation in its own right. So I'm going to just share one or two anecdotes from this project, again, as a way to try and emphasize how much iteration and thinking through making really shaped the way this project developed. So I'm trying to say and trying to emphasize that making, producing, experimenting in physical material terms is not only a production process, but it's a creative one. And that's something which I hope you can recognize and find inspiration from in your own projects. So one of my first experiments for this project was to try and get a sense of space travel at 1-to-1. And so here is a geodesic sphere that approximated the scale of a particular Soyuz capsule. So the size of a vehicle that human beings would sit in as they were launched off planet Earth. And so this capsule became the basis for me trying to figure out, okay, if I'm imagining a one-way journey, what kind of vehicle am I imagining? What kind of experience does this this spatial design afford? And so I first made this to try and get a sense of the physical scale, and also to try and start sketching out, in very loose terms, the interior of a possible space capsule. And this then led to different filmic experiments, and one, I suppose you could say, a happy accident, or a kind of an effect that became kind of integral to the project, that was very much a kind of a consequence of building this first capsule. And this was an attempt to represent the interior of a spatial design through a kind of panning camera mechanism. So I wanted to try and create a kind of a panning horizontal surveying of the interior of this sketch of a space capsule. And I used this with a web camera and a kind of crystal ball mirror ball motor. So very lo-fi, kind of ready to hand materials. And I was always thinking about this camera move as a sort of a horizontal axis. But then I switched the axis to a vertical, and the rotation was now kind of going on a vertical way. You can see my hands moving. And this, coupled with me leaning with the camera in a more kind of improvisatory choreography, allowed me to realize that I can create a sense of zero gravity from within this space capsule. And this kind of turning of the camera, and coupled with my movement, suddenly there was no up or down or left or right, much as the experience of floating out of space is described as kind of free falling, where the kind of one's coordinates are disorientated. So this kind of stumbled upon special effects through the making really informed how I would then produce the film moving forward. And so from the mirror ball camera, the mirror ball and the motor and the web camera, I then developed something a bit more rugged and a bit more bespoke for producing higher definition imagery. And you can see on the left here is another rig where I use the same kind of rotation principle to try and showcase one of the milestones of the mission, which was the last piece of fresh fruit. And in this case, it was symbolized by the last banana. And this last banana was essentially, it was double-sided taped onto an acrylic disc that allowed me to kind of film through it, as you maybe saw in the film clip earlier. And so again, very lo-fi means in a way, very immediate, very honest, but nevertheless can produce some otherworldly imagery. And again, back to the capsule. So from the first experiment, I realized that in both filmic terms and, let's say, more in terms of like what it means to go on a long duration space voyage, this capsule was nowhere near big enough. And so I then thought I should extend it, this kind of sphere, into more of a cylinder. And you can see the capsule coming together on the right-hand side here. And as you can see, also, there was a lot of negotiation in terms of just trying to make the capsule stand up and to try and keep the integrity of the dome. And, you know, because of the joys of film sets, you can be very improvisatory and kind of messy, I guess, from the outside to make it work. And so now this is another image of the completed capsule. And this was a first iteration in which the film was made. And in terms of the detailing, I'm going to show a second iteration now. There's a certain logic to the way that the set was built. So as you can maybe see, there are these different layers going on, where you start with more kind of the macro main shapes that inform perhaps ideas of panels or windows, and the dome itself made up of these geodesic triangles. But then you start to zoom in and start to detail buttons and screws and dials. But this is again going back to this idea of the change of framing, the found fantastic. By building this capsule the way I did, it opened up another kind of context for a different aesthetic language to emerge. So in this case, the blue buttons are bottle tops from plastic water bottles, and the black dials, they are takeaway coffee lids. So maybe you already gathered that, but I was interested in how by placing them within the context of this space capsule, these found objects, their fantastic potential is somehow enabled, or this change of framing allows one to use them for science fiction storytelling. So just this idea of how a change of context, developing a certain language, can give new meaning to everyday found objects that you can find. And so, as I mentioned, the capsule itself, in a way, it sort of took precedence over the film in a way, and emerged as a sort of standout piece of the project, which was not as I intended. But I'm also interested to see how in the making, this space capsule really stood out as a standalone artifact, and I was pleased to exhibit it in different exhibitions after the project. So that was a quick tour of 2 or 3 projects emphasizing thinking through making. And now for this section, I want to expand upon my own research interests into outer space imaginaries. I'm interested to share what they are, how they work, and why it is important to critically engage with imaginative representations of outer space. Important to do, not so easy to say. And again, what I want to emphasize perhaps here is another important theme that I think Sitraka and Andrew have already described to in a way, which is the importance of artifacts, objects, stories, and media as ways to engage with and materialize different futures, whether they are desirable or hopeful or undesirable even. And many of the ideas I'm going to share here are really, the product, or they have emerged from the research that I've made for my PhD at the Basel Academy of Art and Design here in Basel, where I am now. So this is I completed the project, the PhD, in December 2021, and the project is titled Fragmenting a Monolith, Exploring and Disrupting an Outer Space Imaginary. And in this project, I analysed the intricacies of a powerful future vision that is shared by leading space industry actors, that is, of humans as a multiplanetary species. And the PhD research methods and objects, they are interdisciplinary. So there is a text, a book, which is seen here, but also alongside that, the methods and the outputs, they also incorporate video essays and lean on ideas from STS, so this study of science and technology, and also from film theory. And so here, some of the ideas that I want to try and share are very much informed by anthropologists, critical geographers, space historians, and other social sciences and humanities scholars who are really seminal in developing my interests in outer space and imbuing the cosmos with a social thickness and an earthly relativity. So the primary claim of my thesis, or rather the focus of my thesis, is what I describe as a Euro-American outer space imaginary. So an imaginary that is shared and performed by, in particular, Western actors and advocates for outer space settlement. And I'll try and describe a little bit more who they are in particular. But my main, I suppose, claim is that this imaginary, this shared vision of an outer space future, performs as a kind of infrastructure that stabilizes the work of an influential new space community within a changing space sector. And through different kinds of analysis, I study the aesthetic gestures and the rhetorical framings that I find at the heart of this infrastructure, and describe what renders this future vision not only powerful, but also problematic. And here I trace different historical patterns of imagery and thought, and critique the North American myths and metaphors that saturate its representations of a desirable off-world future. And a bit more conceptual work to do here, I suppose, but it's going to get a bit more material very soon. So I want to just share 2 concepts from the social sciences that I find particularly important for helping me understand this particular space settlement imaginary as a kind of infrastructure. And I also hope that they can be in some ways inspiring for thinking about how you can develop your own speculative cosmologies as part of the project that this talk is part of. And so the first of these concepts is called the socio-technical imaginary by 2 sociologists, Sheila Jasanoff and Sang-Hyun Kim, and they describe this imaginary as a vision of a desirable future based on scientific and technological development that is collectively held, institutionally stabilized, and publicly performed. And here I want to emphasize a bit the emphasis on performance in this means of holding something collectively. And the second complementary idea is the socio-technical trajectory, which is described or defined by 2 anthropologists, Lisa Messeri and Janet Fertesi, and they describe this trajectory as a path which is materialized by media and technological artifacts, orienting techno-scientific communities towards imagined futures. So from these ideas together, I learned that images of the future are stabilizing forces with a capacity to organize communities, to affirm identities, and to justify activities in the present by inspiring anticipation about the promise of possible futures. And most importantly here, I think, is that they both stress the importance of materializations and performance, where technological artifacts, stories, and media representations create instantiations or materializations, concretizations, choose your Asians, word of choice. These different artifacts, stories, and media representations, they all are ways of materializing these kinds of desirable futures. So what do I mean by this? I'm going to try and wrap these ideas, or rather weave them into a kind of case study here, which hopefully can demonstrate how a certain spaceflight imaginary can act as an infrastructure. So in this image here, we see Silicon Valley billionaire Jeff Bezos presenting his space flight company, Blue Origin's lunar lander prototype in Washington, DC in 2019. And so Blue Origin's mission is to build a road, in Bezos's words, to a future where millions of people, millions of human beings are living and working in outer space. And this Blue Moon lunar lander is one demonstration from Blue Origin's point of view of a certain technical capability for building towards this future. So this lunar lander is part of a kind of overall pitch by Blue Origin to be part of NASA's next missions to the moon, where there's a renewed ambition for bringing human beings back to the moon as a certain gateway or a kind of milestone for developing missions that reach further out into the cosmos. And so Jeff Bezos is one leading figure in a changing space industry where, together with Elon Musk, we are seeing two billionaires who are really shaping a change where private commercial companies who are working for profit are leading the kind of collective human efforts or to kind of, I suppose, to be part of a second global space race. And so now we are seeing, in particular, Elon Musk's company SpaceX take on more and more NASA contracts, and it's actually the rockets built by Silicon Valley billionaires who are taking astronauts back to the International Space Station. So they're not just talking the talk, as it were, they also are building the rockets. They are demonstrating the technological potential to really shape the future of humans in outer space. So that was a long introduction, but this is what we're looking at here. And interestingly, alongside this, in the same time frame, in the same presentation, in fact, Bezos also presented images such as this, which is a rendering of a space colony where these human beings in their millions can live and work in outer space. And this is one of a series of artist renderings where Blue Origin are trying to imagine what this promising outer space future can look like. And this is also part of a proposal by Bezos to move heavy industry off-world and turn Earth into a national park or zoned as a residential area. And so this is one habitat among others which describe space elk, as you can see in the foreground here, eagles, drones, megacities, all serving a kind of a symbolism, or they're symbolizing the promise of a new or renewed space frontier that Bezos and other new spaces are building the road towards. Also, for clarification, when I say new space is kind of the umbrella term for describing these commercial space companies, and this more of a kind of, what's the word? This rising economic social movement of commercial space actors who have ambitions for developing human futures in outer space. So these are two very different materializations of a desirable future going on. But what's also important to think about here is that whereas this image it's rich, it's vivid, it holds a certain promise and is loaded with different kinds of visual associations, it is also very pastiche. It's a real imitation of imagery that was designed and imagined 50 years earlier. So here, which I think you may have already seen some examples of this, this is one example of a series of images that were made of space habitats that were envisioned in a particular NASA-sponsored summer study in 1975 that was led by a particular physicist and futurist called Gerard K. O'Neill. And leading this team, O'Neill envisioned these enormous floating megastructures that were homes to tens of thousands of inhabitants that were his answer to what he saw as a problem of, I suppose, a limits to growth on planet Earth. This is already in the 1970s where this sort of, this image of limits was inspiring O'Neill to question whether the surface of a planet such as planet Earth is the best place for an expanding civilization. And these sorts of floating megastructures off Earth, these floating habitats, were his answer to these kinds of problems. And so you can see there's a kind of real repetition going on in terms of this sort of greens, this domesticity. But also what's important to note here is that even though these designs are supposed to be futuristic, O'Neill is really drawing from very conservative, very earthly images to imagine this space future. So in this case, he was instructing his these artists, these concept artists, to refer to European country villages to kind of create this sense of a kind of suburbia in outer space. There's no real kind of radical renewal of architecture going on. It's very much a kind of case of more of the same, repeating in an extraterrestrial context. So you can see here these two images of the summer study designs on the left and the Blue Origin studies on the right, and you can really see this note-for-note repetition going on. And it's worth noting just how, I suppose, unimaginative these Silicon Valley fueled new space visions of the future are. They're very much leaning on historical ideas, and which themselves are far from radical, far from revolutionary. In fact, many of O'Neill's designs that are on the left-hand side have been critiqued by many scholars as designs that appeal to a 1950s middle-class white sensibility. They're reimagining a kind of domestic suburban ideal in outer space. And so you see here this kind of implications of what it means to imagine outer space in this way, even in 2019, where you have a kind of troubling continuation of a very middle-class white suburbia from, you know, an ideal of 70 years ago, still repeating, still informing those who have the financial and the technical capabilities to shape outer space futures. So just going back to this idea of, you know, we have the Blue Origin's lunar lander on the left, this very material, tangible, engineered object on the left, and this more fantastical, artistic renderings on the right. And in both their cases, they are artifacts that are working to materialize this trajectory, to go back to this idea of Messeri and Vitesi, this idea of what does a path towards a desirable future look like? Here is one example of that, and how, you know, working at different timescales, this sort of near future promise of shaping the next steps to go back to the moon, and then the promise of this future far, far away, where the kind of promise of a kind of thriving off-world future for humankind is laid out. And so, but of course, on the right-hand side, there's also a case of a sense of a kind of placeholder. There's not a lot of specificity going on. There's a lot of copying and pasting. this idea of a space elk as something we can actually have. It's a very, I'd say, superficial image at this point. There's not a lot of resolution going on. Even just the perspective of seeing this kind of this image of a space colony disappearing into a vanishing point in the distance. We're very removed from it. We're not really experiencing what this future really means in a kind of a granular detail. But nevertheless, they hold a power. They kind of represent this promise of a space future. They're both meaningful in different ways. So, moving into the third part of the talk now. You can have another sip of water. Can you hear me okay? I can't see you, so it's quite strange. I feel like I'm having a monologue to myself.
It's okay to yourself. No, we can hear you properly.
Great, good to hear. I think I've got about another 10 minutes and then we can have some questions.
Sounds good.
So after that rather dense description of outer space imaginaries and why I find them interesting and important to think about, going back to this idea of, well, rather I want to frame it as a kind of question to sort of preface the next part of the talk, which is, if shared visions of the future can be materialized by different artifacts and collectively held by different kinds of performance, what alternative visions of the future can we imagine on Earth and in outer space? And without coming to a definitive answer, I rather would like to consider the potential of space simulations, or rather to maybe justify my interest in outer space simulations as a means for imagining alternative futures. So what do I mean by space simulations? I suppose I'm going to try. It's this idea of a particular experiment, a thought experiment, or rather, let me start again. It's about groups of people, often scientists or astronauts in training, or space agencies or independent agencies, creating experiences of outer space on Earth, where they will build dedicated space habitats. They will choose a dedicated location that is an analog, like an off-world location, be it Mars or the Moon, and they will enact some sort of future scenario, live, perform it, inhabit this world. And I'm really interested in space simulations because I feel that there's a lot to be said about, well, not least the found fantastic, this idea of, for example, in this case, this is D-Mars. This is a project which I think is, yes, it's based in Israel, and they make use of the desert desolation of some parts of the Israeli geography to place their space habitat. And they use this desolation, this emptiness of a landscape, and change its framing by donning spacesuits and stepping in and inhabiting this artificial space, this environment. And I'm interested in how the spacesuits, the habitats, they are not necessarily ready for space. You could not wear them and land them on the moon, but and expect to survive. But nevertheless, they are enough to trigger their imaginations, the kind of embodied experiences of these simulator astronauts, to imagine as if, and to perform these futures as if they were there. So the there of the future replaces the here of the present, and there's a certain kind of attunement going on, and so I'm really interested in how these different objects and artifacts can trigger imaginations in a meaningful way. And again, going back to the found fantastic, in this case, it's about the landscape being perhaps, it's the science fictional potential of a certain landscape to perform as another planet, and how the space habitat and the spacesuits change the framing to produce that shift. But also I want to talk about what I find to be the mutual characteristics of space simulations and science fictions and speculative fictions, where in both cases designed artifacts, scripts, rituals, they all help to generate experiences of imagined futures and worlds. And so I'm trying to use this slide to try and, I suppose, play on this mutual shared science fictional mechanisms between the two. So on the top we have a still from Stanley Kubrick's 2001: A Space Odyssey, and on the bottom we have a image from a particular simulation, a Mars mission simulation called MDRS, Mars Desert Research Station, which is based out in Utah, in the deserts there. And maybe you can perhaps recognize it. It also, this habitat formed the basis for my Basel building site skip experiment. It was the sort of figure for my Mars base. But in both cases, I think what's interesting about where outer space simulations and science fictions come together is that they're both based on rendering futures tangible, relatable, and depending on the intentions of the project, they also render these futures questionable. They both work as thought experiments. They both use, or rather, they're both practices. They are based upon methods of describing, for generating engaging imagery and experiences, in producing different kinds of knowledge. So where on the one hand, simulations are often motivated by an effort to generate knowledge of outer space and human space exploration that is somehow applicable for future space missions. So for example, the study of astronauts' behavior if they're confined to the same space and the same people for 500 days on a mission to Mars. But on the other hand, in a more science fictional sense, this inhabiting or exploration of otherness can also become a critique, or rather a vehicle for critiquing the here and now. So even though many of the kind of processes or the artifacts, even space habitats, space helmets, space suits, enacting space scenarios, scripts, they're present in both kinds of experiments, but changing the framing, changing the motivation can in a way shift their potential for producing different kinds of knowledge. So I'm going to talk about two projects here, which I think kind of both sit on this kind of intersection of science fiction and outer space simulation. They both use and explore the potential of building sets and creating objects for imagining and enacting future scenarios. They both demonstrate the potential for hands-on making as a dedicated means of researching outer space in different contexts. And so I'm not going to say that they are, let's say, I don't want to say that they imagine alternative futures in exceptional or exemplary ways, but I think nevertheless they really point to a potential for a way of working for reaching towards alternative images of the future and thereby alternative imaginaries. So not only future images that are individually held but collectively held. So that was a long introduction. Let's talk about the project. So the first one is called Capricorn 2, a Mars mission simulation. And this was a project, a workshop project with the University of the Underground, which was part of the Sandberg Institute in Amsterdam. And the short story is, in the space of 2 days, we created an immersive experience of a Mars mission in a basement underneath a bar in Amsterdam. And we did this through empowering the students to develop and to design and build different sets that were particular to simulating a kind of mission, and also for playing through different roles and scripts that that were consistent with a particular kind of mission protocol. And so I collaborated together with a space architect, Dr. Barbara Imhoff, and her expertise in playing out and designing space mission simulations where a certain rigor in the protocols, in the process, in the kind of team play was important. It kind of met my interests and my background in lo-fi, simple material, set design and building. And so together we built these, with the students, these 4 terrains, or 4 sets rather. The first 3 are at 1-to-1. There was an Earth mission control, a Mars habitat, a Mars rover cockpit, and the 4th one on the bottom right is a bit of an exception. It's a mini Mars terrain that was where a kind of, you can see here, it's just an iPhone held up on a remote control car via a plastic coffee cup. which was the kind of eyes and ears of a Mars rover that was navigating this Mars terrain, which I quite love because it's just so simple. It's scrunched up paper and cardboard sprinkled liberally with cocoa powder, and that was somehow enough to describe a speculative Mars terrain. And so the students were responsible in groups for taking on the design and the building of different stations, and they all brought their own individual idiosyncratic details to their spaces. And just in terms of like the practical sense of the making, going back to the one-way ticket example, there was a sort of shift from the more macro shapes of defining the spaces and zooming in onto the details. And again, the material basis was very simple, I suppose, in terms of wood, cardboard, found objects, and that was a way for them to generate and produce more detailed designs. And going back to the protocol, there were particular roles, particular mission scenarios that were played out by the students in a kind of iteration, so they would all have a chance to try these different roles. And in a way, it sounds very very particular, but in a way actually staying close to the script, such as don't say yes, say copy, or no, don't say no, say negative. Barbara was a real stickler for this, but I think it really helped in kind of, again, like immersing the students into the scenario. And this was coupled with a use of a time delay, so that mission control on Earth was separated from the Mars sets just by a wall in the basement, but we created a sense of distance through enforcing a kind of time delay on the communication. So we used, again, very simple, ready-to-hand video conferencing setups, but enforced this delay. And you can see here on the bottom left, the students were very very resourceful, very inventive in terms of dedicating a certain mission pack where their iPhone could sit and kind of, produce a transmission from Mars back down to Earth. And so this combination of the kind of communication protocol and the time delay really helped kind of create this heightened resolution about generating experiences of being on Mars. And so I think here, in this case, there's a real exciting potential for producing future scenarios with a certain kind of aesthetic language that can nevertheless be not just playful, but also immersive and meaningful. So here you can see some images of the mission control and into the extravehicular activities. So they had to go and do a Mars walk and pick up particular Mars rocks for further analysis. So you can see here the kind of details of the space suits and how a basement in Amsterdam was transformed into a Mars simulation. So here's some more images coming together. And now, is there anything else I wanted to say here? Yeah, so on to the last project before we can break out. So this is Reimagining Outer Space, which was a collaboration with our very own Sitraka. Sitraka and I, we worked together for another workshop based at the HED in Geneva, the Geneva Art and Design University, and it was called Reimagining Outer Space. And the premise was about what sorts of alternative human space futures can we imagine? Going back to the question I posed earlier. And in this case, we invited the students to imagine, to prototype, and to produce their own personal visions of human futures in outer space. And again, we based the workshop in rapid prototyping, simple materials, for producing sets and objects, which were ways of both representing but also exploring these futures. And so we set these futures on different contexts, from a moon colony to a traveling spacecraft to Alpha Centauri or a greenhouse on Mars. So there was a diversity about the context, and that was also mirrored by a diversity of characters who were reflecting or responding to different motivations such as survival, progress, profit, or environmental concerns. And it was interesting to see how the students brought very earthly, mundane stories to extraterrestrial contexts. So there were, for example, there were journalists or Instagram influencers, farmers who were dealing with ideas of death or loneliness or corruption or crime. And so you had this real intermingling of different earthly ideas and associations that were nevertheless transformed by an extraterrestrial context. And I want to share this project because I think it's a really interesting prototype for thinking about how we can use these sorts of physical rapid prototyping methods for imagining alternative space futures. And there were particular exercises that I think were very fruitful. One of this was a prompt for the students to design and to make their space helmets for their different characters. So in this case, the journalist, the mourning relative, the Instagram influencer, they were all, we all kind of invited the students to describe their characters through the space helmet, through this very iconic object. And actually, after more conceptual research, we found this was a really generative exercise whereby just through prototyping, iterating in simple materials like cardboard, it was a way for them to really jump into their characters and to try and not only bring out certain details in the designs, but also use these details as a basis for developing the characters and the worlds they inhabit further. So I think taking on these iconic objects and transforming them and to develop them in the making as a way of research, I think was really powerful here. And then these characters would also kind of come together in different sets that were representing the different space contexts. So here's an image of the Martian greenhouse, and here we have the lobby for a lunar hotel. And I think through developing their characters, just starting to imagine them inhabiting these different worlds, we used film again to realize or to represent their scenarios at the end of the workshop. I also want to note that the images of this project are black and white, simply to kind of demonstrate a interest in how, through the camera lens again, the cardboardness of the materials that you're working with can somehow disappear or become more solid, and the textures can be imagined as other materials. It's another transformation through the camera lens going on that you can think about. So to end, I want to again reflect upon how, through thinking through making, through embracing the found fantastic, through changing the framing of materials, through developing ideas in the making, you can reach towards, or rather we, in the grander sense, we can reach towards outer space futures that go against the more heteronormative narratives that are populating the space industry today, and to develop exciting and interesting speculative cosmologies. And I thought I would end with a short trailer that summarizes the work of the students in this particular project. So I hope it plays okay. Here it is.
Your helmet is ready. Please retrieve your helmet.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. That was great. That was nice. Does anyone have questions, comments, anything? If you want to have if you have a question or comment, would be quite good if you come here, so actually closer to the microphone, since I'm using my laptop.
Hello.
Hello.
Thank you for that presentation. It was cool. I just had a question around, you just made that point around the heteronormative, kind of traditional way in which the speculative space design has been kind of happening in the past, and you're using, this practice, what you're doing and what you've done with students to kind of explore that more. I guess my question is, there are billionaires right now that are sort of the gatekeepers of this, explorative space realm, right? And yeah, they're sort of the gatekeepers. So how do you, using speculative design as the medium, or like using, the thoughts that come out of, the workshops that are conducted, how do we help to break through? Like, how do we basically connect the dots between all the great organic ideas that are coming out of these speculative workshops, and like, how are we going to essentially promote change and get through to the 1 to 5 folks that have the resources, unfortunately, to do anything?
Yeah, good question. Thank you. Well, hey, I think, well, the first thing I want to say is that I think there are certain places which, maybe there's not a kind of overwhelming, satisfactory, okay, this is the route to Jeff Bezos's office, and this is how we're going to kind of change his mind. But I think there are nevertheless important sites for engaging wider publics, and also for, I guess, maybe enacting smaller scale interventions. I think one of those, I think, a good example is something that Sitraka and I have both participated in, which is the International Astronautical Congress, which is a yearly event, the kind of largest of the space industry. And within that, that coming together, there are different, I suppose, institutions, or kind of or more to the point, there are cultural sections which are one space where alternative imagery and imaginings can have a voice. I think it's also about different kinds of disruptions. So not to say there's not really a clear answer I can give. I still think it's something where it's about where the audiences are. The space conference is one of those, and thinking about different strategies of disseminating your ideas. So of course, on a small scale, I'm happy that Sitraka and I can engage art and design students who are, of course, let's say, open or more open to these kinds of ways of thinking. But I think there's also means of intervening in more industry-oriented contexts. So it's a try and finish my long-winded answer. Maybe Sitraka can also chime in, because I think it's a good question for him too. I think it's an important issue. It's also one where I think there are a range of different sites or possible points of intervention, from space conferences to film screenings to actually going to space policy conferences, or different space agencies, and working closer to them. I think Nelly Benayoun is also someone to look at as a designer. She's really very proactive, very unafraid to kind of knock on different doors, and she is herself a kind of artist in residence at SETI, and she's also made different films which work directly with key actors in the space industry. So there are different examples out there too.
I just want to add to this. So in the Congress that we participate in too, it's like you just don't go to the Congress, you also submit an abstract and you actually present a paper. And it's a very interesting thing, because then it's a space where you've got lots of people in suit working in the space industry, looking to sign contracts and sell rockets and things like that. And then you come in as an artist or a designer with a completely different background, and you're presenting your project or the thoughts of your students, or like from randomers in the public or public audiences and stuff, in these particular contexts on the same level. And then you may end up in a situation where you're part of a panel and you actually discuss with other people who come from a very, very different background and never actually thought about design even as a way of as a medium to actually think differently, shift perspectives and things like that. And this is actually where the change happens in a kind of very small incremental level. So the first time I went to this particular conference was in 2017. And the first time I was there, I was very shocked because there was very little diversity in terms of type of people being there. Not only, I'm not talking only from an ethnic perspective, but also from a sort of mindset, what kind of they're there to do business and things like that. And the last time, so further and further, every single time we would go there because it's a yearly thing. There's the little group of people that we were doing this sort of design and art orientated use of space culture and things slowly grew and grew a little bit bigger and grew bigger to the point that there's other sort of committees that are being created with the idea of implementing different voices within this particular sector and etc. So one thing that is very interesting is the fact that then you also engage only as far as you're willing to do so, in the sense that in order to engage with this particular group of people in this particular industry, something that is actually quite tricky or quite difficult to do, especially if you come from a design and art background, is the fact that you need to engage with the bureaucracy as well a bit, and all the protocols that are actually forming these rituals around it. There's no kind of you can't, you won't be coming, you won't show some art and then it'll be oh my God, this is, the shit or whatever. So you have to engage with the level of the policies and things that are, and some artists Nelly Benayoun does that, Nahum as well does that. It's some artists who are working in the space sector actually are interested in engaging with that level, and it's pretty good that we have this thing. But those changes are super incremental. The other thing as well I'd say is just by having the opportunity to run workshops in educational settings, that's as well a way of changing things, in the sense that you've been exposed to some aspects of that through this particular talk. Eventually, throughout the project itself, you will, in whatever respect, you will carry some of it with you as you graduate and go out in the world and look at things differently as well. So, it isn't necessarily impactful as in overnight shift, suddenly people are thinking about it, etc. But there's, little things that you do here and there. And also, I think it's more about the generation or the production of that particular knowledge, knowing that not everyone lose the sort of naivety is something that will take time, but this is something that I think collectively as a sort of in the time that we are at the moment as well, there's a lot of kind of tumultuous and stuff. There's a lot of questioning that are happening with regard to this. And I do think that some of more sort of experimental, more kind of those kind of approaches to design and stuff, actually to a certain extent, have some role to play in that on a smaller scale.
I mean, to be fair, I wasn't expecting a clear-cut answer, but more so a lot of complexity behind it. It's just, I was curious about, what are the incremental steps to get a consistent seat at the table, right? So, thank you.
Any other questions? I have a question, and then everyone looks tired. Are you tired? What's that? What happened? I have a question regarding to when you do the workshops, like the one, the Joy Offset, or even the one that we did together. I'm just wondering, how do you, after that, extract the key insights? Do you have a series of methods that they're using, metrics that, or is it just depending on what happened and what you recorded from that particular workshop or stuff? How do you analyze it and then create anything insightful?
I suppose there are certain, in terms of the going into the workshop, I think also from experience, there are certain things that I would look to try and encourage. I think some of the things that I described today align with that. But in terms of what I find, I think it's very much, let's say, a more organic, I want to say heuristic process, in terms of it's a kind of intuitive thing. I think in a way, I'm not a, what's the word? I wouldn't describe myself as a scientist, so maybe this is kind of too generalizing, but I'm not kind of looking to analyze my data through set kind of formulas or kind of statistical readings, for example. I think it's very much a question of the feeling and the kind of response of the students to the kind of exercises I would invite them to partake in. And I think it's just, you know, the good thing is that I've had the opportunity to run these workshops kind of multiple times. For example, I mean, Sitraka just described this, the joy of sets. It's kind of like the umbrella for what certainly the space simulation mission project was about. And I think I'm happy to see a kind of consistency in terms of, let's say, I mean, just thinking with your project in mind, in terms of, you know, this kind of joy of working in a sort of non-precious way, how actually being less precious about your materials and to a certain extent your ideas can really help you to develop them in a more rapid pace and to kind of find the joy in it as well. I think there's really a correlation between the kind of joy that you have in your work and the results that you produce. And I think it's also something where I've been happy to sort of see the progression of the workshops I've been running and their kind of adaptability from first and foremost thinking or like encouraging students to work at a certain scale, such as building sets up 1-to-1, or to kind of rapidly prototype objects that they can wear, for example, and break away from the kind of, let's say, the everyday of the computer screen. That was the sort of starting approach, but then seeing how actually you can use that to not only build sets, but also to craft narratives, to imagine futures, to imagine space futures, to create meaningful simulations. So that adaptability is really pleasing for me. But I think in terms of the findings, I think often they sort of, yeah, there's a direct link to how successful the kind of the principles I suppose I want to share are introduced and implemented and I guess taken up by the students.
Yeah. Thanks.
Thank you.
Any other?
Ooh, hand at the back.
It's coming. It's coming.
Hello.
Oh yeah. I guess my question was just on your experience to go on a lot of these conferences and dealing with a lot, as you said with this price, there wasn't lack of as much diversity as a lot of people taught the same mindset. How did you find interacting with people like that and trying to push design as a more of an option? Do you find there was a lot of pushback, or do you find you had to really stand out on your own and fight your own battle with it? How did you find the interaction or cooperation with people that are feeling more business oriented or scientific oriented?
Mm-hmm.
What did you find?
How did I find it? I'm not sure if I've got a satisfactory answer to that, because I feel as though I've been, let's say, my engagements with the outer space industry up until now have not really been so business focused, in terms of I've never really sat, let's say, at the proverbial boardroom table and sort of trying to tell businessmen that they're narrow-minded. It's actually more, as much as fun as that would be, I think I've been so far, I guess, relatively comfortable in the kind of more operating in more artistic and academic spheres, where your chances are you're going to meet more like-minded people. That said, if I can maybe kind of turn the question around, Sitraka and I, we made a trip to a Congress, the International Space Congress in 2019, and it was a real joy to be able to produce a podcast out of a series of interviews that we made with a diverse range of artists and anthropologists from different backgrounds. And so actually, I think what is pleasing to see is that even though, of course, there's much more work to do in that regard, I think there is a real growing, let's say, outer space scene in the arts and also in the social sciences. And actually, I think that diversity of voices is growing. And I very much encourage you all to be part of that in this project and beyond. So I think I'm sorry to say I haven't really had that much experiences with that kind of friction that you're kind of maybe inferring. But perhaps Sitraka has more. I'm kind of deferring to my friend in the room, if you don't mind. I haven't really had that kind of experience, to be fair.
One thing that is quite interesting is the fact that when you're in this particular setup, just to set up this context, it's just you've got these what they call technical sessions, and they all happen during a week at the same time in different rooms in a massive, congress space. And usually technical session, you can go to like a session about the size of a drill bit in order to kind of like drill a hole on the lunar regolith or whatever, to the other side of things, which may be more our side of things, where it's just like, how do you have new haircuts in space or whatever, that kind of stuff. So it's like the range of shit is amazing. And then the thing that is as well part of it is you have a big exhibition where it's a trade show where everyone is there with their rocket, their space agency, whether you've got all the space agencies, but you also have private companies as well there demonstrating that they can make rockets and etc. And they try to sell things to each other throughout the entire week of the particular congress. And then when you get there, it's very interesting because when you go into technical sessions, you have more conversation, to a certain extent more academic in terms of like what it means, what the work that you're doing. And then sometimes they don't want to listen to you because they're only interested in rockets and things like that. And then when you go to the trade show, they're like on the sales level thing where they kind of try to pitch you because they don't know who you are and perhaps you'd be interested in buying rockets and things like that. And when you're there, and then they start hearing that you work as an artist or as a designer, etc., their first thought is like, oh, public engagement. And they're so happy to jump onto the idea that maybe they can work with artists in order to promote their things. And this is where it becomes very funny, because then you either play with the thing because you're just like, okay, well, the French Space Agency wants to give you money in order to do some random stuff. Why not do, why not play along and etc. Often, the thing that they don't realize is the fact that, when they talk to us, the idea is that public engagement is a sort of like two-way street where you'd be like, okay, if you think that we should engage with space, or if you want people to engage with your particular technology or whatever, you should also be interested in the people that are around it, etc., etc. And this is where often the conversation goes sour and they stop listening to you because they don't understand, because they're like, I don't know, you're doing the sort of like edge of, we at the forefront of progress, whatever they define this, and therefore you should be interested, but we shouldn't necessarily waste time in that particular direction. So it's an interesting thing. But after this said, there's all, if you want to be in that situation and actually infiltrate this environment, it's also a cool way of infiltrating spaces. So they're already aware of you, but more as you can be a designer, you can be an architect. For them, you'll be an artist. They don't have different definition in terms of like, they lack resolution in terms of what's your role. If you engage with like culture, then you're an artist and stuff. And sometimes you can, I guess my point is sometimes you can use it to your own advantage. And sometimes that it works against you because they don't know what category to put you in. But then sometimes they invite you to like sit at committees and then they regret it because suddenly you start saying random shit. And then sometimes it changes like the politics of the particular committee that you're part of, and sometimes it doesn't matter because you're just an artist. So there's no clear, position to have a posture that you may have in this particular thing. And like everything, it really depends on, even though there's a certain mindset, it really depends on the people you're talking to, because, people who are working at Lockheed Martin are going to talk to you different than people who are working in the government agency. Yeah. So, yeah. But it's an interesting space. I mean, I would really encourage you to actually go next year. It's going to be in Milan. It's going to be in September, October. So I would really encourage you to actually go there because it's very bizarre, to say the least. And at the same time, interesting.
Thank you.
Thank you. While you're walking back to your seat, maybe I can also just add a reflection on that. You can keep going, don't worry. I was just thinking about, we talked about the space conference, and I think it's kind of moving into a space where, you really can be exposed to the real workings of the space industry, which is, very much about governmental politics, international cooperation, negotiation, economics. It's so richly multi-layered, and that's just on a kind of purely administrative level. And I think what I would want to say is that if you're interested in exploring that and kind of intervening through that kind of way, it's more power to you. But I think also what's worth saying is that I think what these engineers or rocket scientists or space policy negotiators, or even going down to Jeff Bezos and the billionaires, as I hope to kind of shared in my talk, there's not a lot of imaginative literacy going on. A lot of the kind of images that they will use to contextualize their projects is really, Star Trek, Star Wars, nothing particularly interesting, let's say, unless you like those things. I mean, I'm digging myself a hole now. All I want to say that, I think what as artists and designers you can bring is that imaginative literacy, just what kind of visions you can produce and really what they mean. And I think a lot of what, as you can see in the Blue Origin examples, is that there's not a lot of care given to the meaning of the images that are, in a way, fueling these shared ambitions for off-world futures or representing a certain promise. They're on the one hand very, very far away, but they're also very vague and they're very unimaginative. And so there's a real space for designers to work there. So that kind of, in amongst all those frictions of politics, engineering, logistical negotiations, there's also a space to act, which I think is, it's not want to say there for the taking, but it's somehow, it's ready to be explored in a more in-depth way. And this is where you can come in.
I think this is a very important point in the sense that Jeff Bezos redoing Gerald K. O'Neill's landscapes and stuff, it's not because they really like this thing, it's because they can't think of anything else. It's been set, and it's just how it happens, and then this is how this imaginary is constructed.
There's a sense of nostalgia as well.
In those things,
of alluding to an idea that is already settled in the minds of people, recovering something that was covered and wrapped in beautiful promises, and bringing a new idea or different approach could be incredibly much riskier. Mm-hmm. So it really plays along with that sense of old, of nostalgia, of comfort, of security, living in the empty void that is space. So in a way, I think it really alludes to that as well. Yeah, it plays really safely.
Yeah, but it's also a certain kind of nostalgia.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's not everyone's. So that's the thing that is quite interesting as well.
Totally.
Sorry, maybe you wanted to say something about nostalgia in your study of imaginaries.
Yes, I agree. It's a very important point to think about. Not least to think about, as I can't see who said the comment, but as they were intimating, I think it's also about, for example, the science fictions that these billionaires were reading growing up. Hello. And also the kind of the legacy of the Apollo program. There's many of these commercial space actors are motivated by this sort of frustration of a slow-moving NASA to fulfill what they saw as the first steps to a kind of a thriving human future in outer space, when actually the reality was that it was a performative theatrical act of the Cold War. It kind of it's in a way it killed manned space exploration in that paradigm on the spot. So there's a lot of nostalgia, misremembering, I suppose, going on, and also a lot of referring to the familiar, the kind of comfort of their childhood, and this sort of this is something that I find very interesting, is that this referring to these historical narratives, these kind of 1950s ideologies and fictions as precedents. They produce these gaps, not only in terms of what the realities of living in space actually mean, but also a certain sense of being with the times, I suppose, and who these futures are for and what they represent. So that's what in a way we have to question, why is a 1950s image of suburbia the kind of the desirable future of the 21st century?
The good old days.
Is more of the same.
Okay, it's getting late, so I'm going to wrap up here. But thank you again so much for joining us, and thank you for your amazing presentation.
Thank you, Joseph. We know you're actually in space right now. Um,
Yes.
And thank you very much for that blindfolded delivery. It was stunning. Yeah, sorry that there was no feedback whatsoever on our side.
No.
Yeah, but it was great. Thank you very much. Very lucky to have you.
Thank you so much. It was a real pleasure. Glad you
Thanks.
enjoyed it.
Well. This conversation is all recorded, so it will be available for you on, right, if you want to watch it again and things like that. Can I share the little trailer as well?
Yes, you may.
Okay, so I put that into the files on Teams and things like that, so everything will be there. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Now.
Thank you.
I'll catch up with you soon-ish. That would be great, especially because I probably have questions regarding PhD stuff.
Oh, yeah.
But yeah, no, sounds good.
Okay.
Well, thank you so much, man.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me. See you soon.
Cheers.
Bye.